Welcome, everyone, to the companion podcast to Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. I'm Ray Sidney Smith, along with my co author and my co host, Steve Orr. How's it going, Steve?
Ray, hanging in, always a pleasure to do these episodes.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Good to have you. Good to see you. All that fun stuff and all that jazz. In this episode, we're going to be diving into chapter 10 in the book, which is promoting your podcast. And we've got a lot of background kind of discussion that we had in preparation for this chapter. But most importantly, we want to drive home the fact that publishing is not promotion. You can create a beautiful podcast, do all the production, distribute perfectly to every directory. You can optimize your RSS feed and still crickets. No one listening to it. And that's not the fault of any of those pieces, right? Promotion right now is what we consider a non-optional approach to basically putting your system into work of publishing your podcast episodes. You need to realize that this is just part of the work that needs to be done for every episode. And so in this episode, we're going to cover why most podcasters misunderstand promotion, and that's because they think of it as something other than part of the business operations, right? The difference between the different parts of what we're talking about here. So we developed kind of the three Ds of promoting your podcast, and we're going to kind of break that apart and discuss it separately from marketing. We're going to talk about some of the practical ways in which you can promote the podcast really on a sustainable basis, and separating that from what we typically think about when it comes to promoting, and also noting that we detail all of this stuff very specifically in the book. And so we're going to be doing this in a more general sense. And then we'll talk about this as a long term systemic approach, right? Not just once and done, right? This is an ongoing approach to it all. And so let's get started. Let's talk about how you actually promote your podcast. And so let's start with like the big myth. What do you what let's talk about this, Steve. In 1989, there was a movie that came out called The Field of Dreams. You and I know it well. Perhaps some folks who are watching know it well as well, or those listening will know it well. And in it, there's been the paraphrasing of "If you build it, they will come." Right, and what we want to really impress upon you all is how false that statement is when it comes to promoting your podcast. What we talk about in chapter 10 is this real development of what we ultimately called the three Ds: distribution, discovery, and development. But it did not start there. It started as multiple other terms. Do you want to kind of give some color to that, Steve?
Yes, we did have some different terms. We like the alliteration and the 3Ds, the distribution, discovery, and development. But I believe we started out with perhaps syndication for one of the three legs of that stool. Maybe we had discovery. I'm trying to remember, but we did have some discussions about how to be more specific with how we broke this chapter down than to just talk about promotion, because promotion is such a vast term that it's really not talking about all the individual parts again of that stool that you need to have this become a successful enterprise. Getting back to the myth, if I build it, they will come. Well, how do they know to come there? And so this chapter really is, let's really give you the steps you need to have them get there. So yes, we had distribution, discovery, and development is what we came to as a final choice for those three steps that you need.
Yeah, and it really came from the fact that we wanted people to understand that they needed to first get their podcast published. They needed to basically make sure that they were getting it out there on the web, and that meant getting it out and via the both website, whether that's an extension of your actual business website and or through a pod page or something like that, Also getting it into the RSS feed, and that meant being able to be found among the directories. Discovery then basically helping you understand that there is all of this SEO and now GEO, generative AI engine optimization, and then getting to that final stage, which is development. And I think a lot of folks in essence, think about podcasting in podcast promotion in terms of, well, I'm putting all these episodes out there and I'm sharing it with the world, but they're not really thinking of it from a business development perspective. And that's what this whole book is about, right? Your business that's podcasting. We want to make sure that you think about this as business development. And by using that term, we wanted to kind of lean on the business terminology that was there. And so that's where we decided, you know what, we could do syndication, we could do distribution, we could do promotion, but it really didn't have the alliterative effects. And I think the 3Ds ultimately helped us circle around, kind of circle the wagons around this core concept that we were trying to get at, which is that you have these three legs of the stool that needed to be really maintained, and development is a really important one. And so, not to put too fine a point on it, I want to cover each of these so that everyone is very clear. When we talk about distribution, it really means syndicating your podcast RSS feed, right? That is that file that you produce on your podcast that allows your episodes to go out and notify folks that new episodes are coming out, and getting those basically listed in the various podcast directories and platforms so that it's accessible to listeners. The next step is discovery, right? That's bringing listeners to your episodes by virtue of creating searchable content. Searchable content being content that is visible across the web. And we know that Google and the other search engines are looking for good content. Your business is all about creating that good content to bring people closer to the fold through consultative sales. You're basically educating people about your business and about the products and services that you provide by virtue of that information you're providing. Then finally, we have this development point, which is basically generating interest, generating notoriety, so to speak, buzz, so that you can expand your audience through all kinds of things, mostly relationship development. And that's why business development makes so much sense here, right? You're encouraging people to bond with you as an audience, colleagues to share your content, and of course, making sure that the media and otherwise find you and promote you. So that's kind of the framework we devised.
So I'm curious, Ray. We have these three legs of the school of the stool. Development as a business development concept here. I'm curious, when we were coming up with these three terms, business development, to me, as someone, from the outside, who is not a marketer, who is not a business person, why in the order of these is the development the third leg of the stool and not the first?
Yeah, it ends up just being a technology reality, right? The technology itself requires you to do the first steps first, because the first two steps first, because if you don't do those two steps first, then you basically don't have anything to do development wise, right? And so you can plan. I mean, business development, of course, is a planning function, and so the whole idea of planning what future growth looks like for a business, right? The typical definition of business development is there. And you can certainly plan this before you start, but you can't do them until the podcast is actually in existence. And so that's why we kind of put it in the perspective of both in the book, how we designed things to be structured for learning about podcasting. Get that distribution, get that podcast RSS feed, get in the directories, then go ahead and start doing the process of putting out posts that are SEO optimized and GEO optimized, and then do the other stuff. And also because you could do development all day, every day, all day long. You know what I mean? Like, you could literally spend the rest of your life doing development. You have to bucket and focus on the things that are going to be most useful for the business, get you the most exposure, and then move on with doing the work of your business, right? You can't make the podcast the whole business.
Yep. So development, basically, to kind of boil it down, then, as you sort of alluded to at first, the development part of this is generating that buzz, and ultimately turning your listeners into advocates for your podcast episodes? Is that how you really see it here?
Yeah, I think they're not just promoters of the podcast itself; they're promoters of the topics that you speak about. And this is where repetition among the episodes, in thematic sense, make a lot of sense. So if I'm always talking about 5 or 6 or 10 topics on my podcast, well, I want my listeners to continue to keep listening so that they learn different parts of those various topics and the tributaries, so that they're not talking about any one specific episode to people. They're like, no, you need to listen to the podcast, and you need to go listen here. But also know that they can say, oh, you know what? When the time comes, I'm going to be top of mind for my podcast, because they're going to say, you know what? I remember when Ray was talking about that subject on the podcast. Let me go ahead and find that episode and send it to you. Right. And that becomes a structured way for you to be able to do that. The other piece is that you, as the podcast host, should be utilizing these episodes in development also, because you should remember what podcast episodes you did. So you can say from a stage, from a phone call, from a sales pitch, hey, you know what? I did a podcast episode just on that topic. That's a great question. You know what? If you go visit my podcast, you can go ahead and find that episode where I talked about that subject. And now you have this extension of the conversation that you otherwise wouldn't be able to have in real time. And now you have more exposure, right? The increased number of marketing touch points increases the opportunity for sales. We know that, right? And some statistics tells us it's touch points. Some say 7, some say 13, some say more than that, right? No matter what it is, we know that the more touch points they have, the more likely they are to sell. And so we should increase that opportunity, that surface for them to be able to dwell on our product, services, brand, or otherwise. And so being able to say, hey, you know what, Steve, you just asked me a really great question about podcast, development. Well, guess what? I've got a podcast episode on that. If you go to my website and look up this title, podcast development for small business, you'll see that I talk all about promoting your podcast. And now what you're going to do is you're going to take note of that. And hopefully, if you are interested, you're going to go listen to me for now 45 minutes, an hour, talk about that subject. And that means you're going to build rapport. You're going to hear more from me, and you're going to determine whether or not I'm the right person that you want to work with, right? This is really a social skills practice, because it's about that reputation and that rapport that you're developing with the listener. And the more time you have that in-head localization, that snapping all the way back to chapters 1 and 2 where we talk about that, now we all of a sudden develop this parasocial relationship, and that's where the magic happens, in essence, right?
So you develop, no pun intended, but you develop a deeper relationship with your audience.
Absolutely. And there's, of course, so many pitfalls for being able to develop a relationship. And so what we wanted to do was talk through maybe some of those pitfalls that folks, the trips and falls that people make when it comes to these things. And so what's maybe a few of them, Steve? You want to start with one?
One of the biggest for me is treating this promotional activity as just, oh, I'm going to post something on LinkedIn and that's it. So to me, that's probably the biggest. Couple of others that I can mention that come to mind is being focused too much on your launch week and then forgetting about letting people know, oh, here's episode 2, here's episode 3, this is what they're about.
Mhm.
A third one for me kind of runs counter to the first 2 that I mentioned. That's trying to be everywhere at once. Sometimes you can go to too many channels and you're not really focused on the channels where your listeners are. And that can be problematic in the long run, because where your listeners are, that's really where you want to be and be the most savvy about trying to reach them and develop those relationships.
And that last one that you mentioned actually circles back to the first one here. So I
Yes.
I think that it's really important for people to understand this, that if you are just trying to push out social and kind of smatter in a way that is not culturally competent to the platforms in which you're posting, but also recognizing that the more energy you give everywhere, the less energy you can give to any specific place. And it's kind of like children, right? You have one child, you can give all of your resources to that one child. You have two children, now you split those resources, three, four, five. In my case, my family has six kids, and I love all of them. But that meant my family had to spread resources across now six children, right? And once upon a time, that made a lot of sense because your kids died. And so, there was a
Boy,
lower,
you went a
more.
different way with that, Ray.
Yeah. No, but I mean, like, back in the 19th century, we had a lot of, obviously, infant mortality was a much higher rate, and so you had more children because you knew that those children would not all survive, and so you had more. Today, we don't have as much of that, so having children is a luxury. Having more children is a luxury that some people take, and my family was lucky enough to do, and I love all of my siblings and all of that jazz, right? Um, that's not necessarily the way it works with social profiles and certainly with marketing channels, right? Now, technology has made all of this much, much easier. But when we go out there and we think, okay, I'm just going to spread, content across all of these channels kind of willy nilly, it needs to be a systemic approach. It needs to actually all still be good. And the idea of basically promoting across those channels does not mean that you don't engage with those posts. So, for example, if I'm gonna do an effective marketing strategy, right, I'm gonna really focus on LinkedIn. That's where my audience is. That's where the predominant amount of my audience is, and probably some of YouTube. And so I've got a primary and secondary. Everything else is gravy. Like if I do anything else, it's because I've taken care of those two places first, right? And that means that I'm going to go to LinkedIn, I'm going to make a post, but I'm also going to socialize that post among people I know who are going to engage, right? So I'm going to call Steve and I'm like, "Hey Steve, I just put out a post on LinkedIn. This is really important to me. Can you comment on it? Can you reshare it?" That kind of thing. That's a manual process. That is a social reputational process. It takes work. And that's how social media works, right? That's how social networking works. It's not just the online stuff. And over time, yes, some of it becomes organic. Some of it becomes people finding your content through the search engine that is built into the social networks. But we have to remember that we've got to go out there and socialize this beyond the technology piece with real people. And then over time, you can then start to concentrate. But if you spread that out to everybody and now everybody's commenting on all your content across 15 social networks, all you're going to be doing all day is, guilty that you haven't responded to anyone, which is rude, right? It would be like me walking into a cocktail party and someone saying, "Hi, Ray, how's it going?" Or if Steve comes up to me and says, "Hi, Ray, how's it going?" And I say nothing, I'm just blank faced to him. I turn around and walk away, right?
That's
That's what's
usually what
happening.
happens with you, Ray. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
No, but like, this is what we know inherently is natural in human interactions. And for some reason in a digital place, we tend to try and deal with it differently. And it's what I've been teaching for the past, 17 years as a part of W3 Consulting is that we need to be more human and humane in our digital marketing. And that's what actually makes us more successful, right? I don't need 10,000 followers. I need a few hundred who are going to buy from me, right? That's what we need in our businesses typically, right? And people think I need all of these vanity metrics, all of these kind of publicity metrics that are not inherently profitable, right? This is about revenue and about profitability. And so one, focus on the platforms that you can share to and effectively engage with people when they do, right? Because ultimately they will engage on those social posts. They won't necessarily engage with your podcast because they may not come to your podcast website and to your blog and comment on it. They'll most likely engage with the posts that are more socialized and a little bit more bite sized. And then next is of course going into this like I'm just going to post, like it's a big bang coming out of the gate with my episodes. And then over time, losing steam because you've burned yourself out on the first week. So, as you talked about in that kind of second big mistake, is that you need to basically look at this as the long game, right? Obviously, you want to make a big splash to some extent about your first episode. Great, whatever. But think about how you're going to do the same thing repeatably over and over and over again, week after week. If you think about that and as what you do in week one, then it's going to lower the bar to what you can actually be and do and accomplish every week going forward. So maybe you do more in week one, but think about what week two through week 50 through week 100 looks like for putting out the podcast episodes. And that means there's a checklist, there's assigned roles, and there are deadlines, all of those kinds of things. And once you have that in place, now people can follow those things and get them. I know that if I don't have a deadline for something, it's not happening, right? Like hands down, just not doing it. Uh, and I don't abide by anything that doesn't have a deadline. And so and also I don't like manufactured deadlines. And so I will also avoid those. And so one, know yourself, know how you best work and how you best work with others so that you can figure out those pieces, right? And that might mean getting support, getting folks to help you, but know what's going on in terms of the systems to make sure this promotional activity is consistent across all those channels. And maybe it's not you that's responding to every comment across social. Maybe that means you have to hire someone to go out there and be the human responding to folks. Maybe you need to engage a tool like ManyChat that's going to be an AI tool that can respond to folks and engage them in the sales process, right? We have all of this technology available to us. Use it, but think of it strategically. Don't just throw it out there and hope for the best, or do a bunch of activity in flurry because it looks like business when it's really busyness, and then that will get you nowhere either.
So I wanted to get back to a couple of things. One of the things when I first said, the common mistakes, trying to be everywhere at once, I said that it kind of reminds me of thinking of, my career in radio and receiving press releases all the time for people pitching story ideas. So if you're trying to be everywhere at once, I had so many people pitch me for so many different things that had nothing to do with what I covered. So getting back to that mistake about trying to be everywhere at once, no, make sure you are in the places that matter to the people you are trying to reach. There was nothing worse than getting 15 pitches in my email box for, yeah, I was a business reporter, anchor reporter, and I was getting all kinds of stuff, nothing that made any sense to what I was doing. So be very, very mindful of that. You touched on this about chasing vanity metrics instead of, that meaningful engagement. So I wanted you to get into that a little bit more to kind of underscore the point that, oh, I had 20,000 downloads, but that really may not matter in so many different ways. Can you break that down a little bit to help folks understand, to help our listeners understand and our watchers here, our viewers, what that really means?
Yeah. So when we think about a podcast, the podcast has all kinds of metrics generally. And then we have social engagement and other kinds of engagement. So think about all the ways in which someone can respond to something digitally when it comes to digital marketing. We only measure because we can in digital marketing. Otherwise, it's just a reality factor that we want to keep doing the activities that we know are going to continue to grow. And this comes out of a whole different framework that I created, which is really community, how we use community as a marketing tool in business, right? Really as a promotional tool. But in more generically, marketing is a much bigger umbrella term for those activities that include product development and pricing, and how product is set in location, and then ultimately promotion, right? The four P's of marketing, so to speak. And so product, price, place, promotion. And so if we think about marketing as that bigger piece of the business, and we're just looking at promotional activities, we are thinking about how to set ourselves in motion in a way that makes sure the business is staying focused on the marketing activities that are going to be most useful to us.
Thank you for adding a little bit to that. So I wanted to add one other
Mhm.
that I think is an important one here is when we're trying to promote the podcast episodes, not integrating that into your existing marketing channels. For instance, let's say you already have a blog, making the mistake of not thinking about your episode as a blog and turning that into a blog post. Very simple way to, use an existing marketing channel as a way to promote your podcast episode. So I think that's a mistake that folks make. And that's just one example. There are plenty of others, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think there are some interesting pieces here that people sometimes don't think about, right? Which is like a blog post related to the podcast episode is really important and powerful if it's done in the right way. But what most likely they're not realizing is that your podcast is probably 6 or 10 blog posts worth of
True.
material connected in the right ways. And depends on whether or not you're using technology to create that or if you're doing that through manual labor or otherwise, you need to figure out how to make those things match and whether or not blogging is appropriate and useful to the business's strategy, right? So, is it useful to the strategy? Well, it's useful if it helps to increase the number of potential leads to the business. So, like it just is a matter of figuring those pieces out. Going back to the being everywhere. I just wanted to make that one additional point here, which is that many times technology allows you to be everywhere because you can just syndicate to those places. And I've already talked about abiding by the culture, right? So you wouldn't post a blog post length post to a microblog site, right? Those are for short, individual, smaller posts with a link. That's what most people are looking for. And I know that some people, turn Twitter/X into a place where you could post basically a tome of information, and that kind of thing. And I mean, it just, for me, it breaks with the culture of why Twitter existed and now other microblogging platforms exist as well. But more importantly, is that being everywhere doesn't necessarily help you. So if you started to go posting your blog posts, your podcast episodes, that is, to say my podcasts are about productivity and technology. And so I start publishing those posts to a mom blog forum, right? Where there's a bunch of mom bloggers, right? Is it really appropriate for me to be posting it there? Yeah, maybe the mom bloggers want to be more productive using technology. Yeah, sure, fine. Is it appropriate for me to be doing that though? No, absolutely not. All right. It is for someone who is in the mom blogger community to say, hey, you know what? I found this episode to be useful. Folks should check this out. I was listening to Ray's podcast. He talked about this subject. It's really pertinent to us. Maybe I interviewed a mom blogger about her productivity system setup, and she detailed how she used her various tools, and that particular mom blogger wanted to share it to her community. It'll open me up to a new audience, right? Maybe some mom bloggers who want to also listen to my podcast. Great. But it's not appropriate for me to be the one blasting them with every episode. Sometimes one share is strategically so much more advantageous than you trying to just be everywhere and spamming people nonstop with content. So just be very mindful of the fact that this is a delicate surgical approach, almost clinical in nature. You need to be consistent with it clinically, surgical in precision, and then of course consistent in the way in which you approach these opportunities, right? Because there are going to be these opportunities that kind of just pop up out of nowhere. Steve and I, before we started recording, a colleague of mine reached out about an opportunity, and this is something that just kind of came out of the blue, right? And we're dialoguing about it, and if it comes to pass, it's because we're jumping on the opportunity. If we don't jump on the opportunity, then it passes by like a ship in the night. So you have to approach each of these things in the same way, right? What is its benefit to you? Is it going to be worthwhile putting in the time and energy to make that worth your time and energy and effort as a business owner, just to promote the podcast? Or is it worth it to do something else, right? And you have to do that cost benefit analysis, but that means pacing and jumping on these things when they happen. In this particular case, this opportunity came at the end of last year, and I touched base with this person and said, "Hey, we're going to talk about this, in a couple of months because I don't have time for it right now." And that was the appropriate time frame. But if this was a reporter, as you know, Steve, you've got a deadline in like 5 hours, right? That's a very different turnaround time for being able to get back to someone and being able to get that kind of earned media. So
I wish I had 5 hours. There are so many times. Well, no, no, it's true. Like let's, for instance, let me give you a for instance of a mistake. You're a business, you have a great podcast episode, you want to promote that episode, you pitch somebody in the media. They're like, "Oh, this is great. I really want to talk to this business owner about this particular topic. I think this is a great topic for a business story." You call them up, they're not available. I'm on a deadline. I may, literally have like a 10-minute deadline here. Like, I got to get this. I need somebody to pick up the phone so I can interview them, turn that around, create this story, and go on the air with it in 20 minutes or a half an hour, whatever it is. Be very mindful of putting out releases or pitching and then not being available. That will do you tremendous harm in the long run if you're not available when you say you're going to be, or yeah, that's like one of the worst things.
yeah,
Uh,
and I think this is part and parcel of the problematic nature of earned media, which is that
mhm.
reporters are on very specific deadlines, and the businesses or other kinds of sources are running on different schedules, and they don't necessarily know each other's cultures very well. And so when you're trying to gain earned media, you need to learn the culture of those things, and that's why businesses hire publicists and they hire folks who can represent them in that regard. Smaller businesses don't always have that opportunity, and sometimes executives of any level size enterprise sometimes kind of dismiss it, and then they bite themselves in the what.
It's well, yes, and it's so much harder. Let's face it, the way that the media, the changes in the media, and all the cutbacks,
Mm.
very, very different ball game. It's so much harder to get that earned media than it used to be. And that also goes back to what I was saying before about a common mistake of trying to be everywhere all at once with your pitches. You're going to piss off a bunch of those journalists who might otherwise be interested in something you have to say, but then you're pitching them so many different things that have nothing to do with what they want to cover, or not what they want to cover, but what they do cover. Be very, very mindful of that. Don't waste a journalist's time, especially in today's world where their time is very, very different than it used to be.
I get that. I wanted to just take a step back because I know you asked me about podcast metrics and some of the key metrics, and I think I veered off
You did a little
left
bit. You
field on
veered
that,
off.
but I want to
Yes.
circle back to it. Yeah, yeah. So I want to come back to that because I lost my train of thought, and I want to make sure that folks get this. One, we can think about podcast metrics as its own class of metrics, and then we can think of all of the other kinds of metrics. So if we think about all the other kinds of ways in which we communicate in a digital marketing perspective, as I said before, you want to focus on the ones that matter the most to you. And so it may be that if you have an email list, you want to focus on replies to the email. You want to focus on open rates, click through rates, that kind of thing, right? And then in the podcast world, we have a few different kinds of metrics that we typically follow, right? One are downloads, any kind of listener engagement, and that depends on the podcast app they're using to listen to you, or the platform if they're coming to your website and listening from the website and clicking on maybe a like button or making a comment on the podcast episode post. Those kinds of things are listener engagement. Replying to an email where they've been notified of the new podcast episode, asking you a question or leaving a comment. Retention, right? They're coming back and listening to episode after episode after episode for how many episodes forward. Getting them to stay a listener for a long period of time is a good sign of someone who is a customer advocate, not necessarily a customer. They could be, they could not be, right? And then of course we have audience demographics. We can learn more about our audience through the signals we receive about where they're located, perhaps their age, gender, those kinds of things. And
And
uh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I wanted to make sure you said the amount of time that your listeners are actually listening. Drop off rates, I believe, is very important.
Right. So that's usually included within retention, right? So retention is how long they listen to an episode, how much of an episode they listen to,
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. We know only some of that data, depending upon what platform they're listening on, right? So if you're downloading a podcast directly from my podcast host, utilizing no streaming, you've just downloaded an episode and then you listen back to it. I may not know that data, but if you're listening on YouTube or on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, where it is streaming, not downloaded and then listened to, then we will know at what point it stops streaming and therefore at what point you stop listening to the episode. So it
Mhm.
just depends on how privacy focused the technology is that you're using to access, and that gives us more or less data. And so we've got to put together a lot of disparate telemetry. Telemetry are all the various signals that are received to help to identify something. And so we've got to put all of this together. So, from my perspective, I think that you should take all of these various metrics and put them together into a singular place. Now, metrics that I don't care about are things like the number of followers you have on Facebook, or the number of likes you have on even a podcast episode post, or on a Facebook post about a particular subject. Those are good for telling you how successful something was on some level, right? People were interested in a subject on a surface level, right? But if I wanted to do that, I would just put pictures of puppies and kittens on social media all day, and I'd make $1 million, right? Like that's a no brainer, right? I could have Google Gemini produce photos and images and videos of puppies and kittens all day, and maybe little alligators with a smile. Like we know what's gonna make them make them little baby alligators nipping it at strawberries, and people would go crazy over it, right? um, that's not what we're here for, right? We have to remember, unless it is you, is that's what you sell as a business, and then good on you.
Or
But
that's your podcast. What if that's your podcast?
sure, if you're selling legal services, it's just it's ridiculous for you to be posting that stuff. And so you need to be able to post stuff that's going to garner meaningful engagement. Okay. And so to some extent, you need to like put out that like uh, uh, little bits of candy, things that are entertaining and educational and, kind of hook based. But you need to also put in some nutritious stuff. You need to be able to feed meaningful content to get out meaningful engagement. And so that means people who are actually engaging with you in a meaningful way. That means commenting, replying to emails, folks that are clicking onto forms where they're filling out content. Those are the things I care about when they DM you to open up a conversation in your DMs, your private messaging or direct messaging tools, when they fill out a form on your website to contact you. That's where now they're serious, because they've gone away from the point of being just a passive listener and being an active person who is real, right? They've
Mhm.
breached that gap, and I think a lot of people don't realize that when you're a passive listener, there's no responsibility to what your thoughts are. But as soon as you open up your email address and expose your name and expose your identity to a business, now you've given them permission to engage and interact with you. And so, as a business owner, when that happens, I know that this is it's my deal to lose, right? It's my opportunity to engage them in the process so that they want to become a customer. Because from my perspective, they clearly have a problem, right? They have a felt need or want from the mere fact they're reaching out to me, and now all I have to do is to pave the way forward for them to be able to find the solution, which is my product or service. And that's what you need to do. You need to approach it from that perspective. And I think that these vanity metrics that people look to are, oh my gosh, I want to have more followers, I want to have more likes on my post, those kinds of things. When in reality, and even downloads to some extent, like who cares about how many downloads you get? The reality factor is how many people are actually contacting you out of the podcast, how many people are actually engaging with you in a meaningful way that is going to make it toward your specific outcomes, right? And that's what's really going to matter the most.
I wanted to get back to, well, let's change gears a little bit here.
Sure.
We touched on earned media. When we talk about promotion, I know you have divided it into 4 buckets here of stuff. So we talked just a little bit about earned media, but let's get into this a little bit. The four practical buckets that you see this in. You want to start with
Sure.
owned media?
Sure. So I'll note this. This is not something that is outlined in the same way in the book. This
Correct.
was a cutting room floor situation, which is that if I really decided to outline this in the way in which I would for any other longer piece of material, I teach this in a 2-day workshop. So this is a much reduced version, and I couldn't even get it into a more reduced version without doubling the size of this chapter, which was already
Yeah,
a big
but points
chapter.
of it are in the book, though. So let's
Yeah,
make that
yeah,
clear too. You
yeah,
can find a lot, so not everything here, but there's some of this in the book.
yeah. And so I just wanted people to know that we boiled it down so that it could be boiled down to be boiled down into something that was practical for them to do. We wanted to be really, this was the essential blueprint. It wasn't the treatise on marketing
War
via
and Peace.
podcast. Yes, exactly, exactly. Or what's the Goldfinch? Goldfinch. I just recently picked up Goldfinch, and it's a big one. And yeah, so the goal here was to give you practical tips. So I didn't really want to get too far into this with you, Steve, in terms of going down this road. But people should understand this is kind of the more Gestalt perspective, which is that we have owned media, we have shared media, and shared means that you are in essence renting space on somebody else's property. So you've owned media. We could easily call it rented media. We then have earned media, and we talked a little bit about that, which is basically we'll talk about that in a minute. Then we have repurposed media. And so those are the four types of media. There are others, but those are the four general types of media. And we think about them from the perspective that we want to basically have systems to make our promotions sustainable for the long term. So how do we make them sustainable? We set up practical steps for being able to do these things pretty much each time we publish an episode or on some kind of recurring basis. And so it's saying like, okay, once a week, I'm going to pitch a podcast on being a guest. And so just once a week, you send out an email to a podcast where you've listened to a few episodes, you've gotten to know who that podcast host is, the types of topics they're interested in, and maybe they'll invite you to be a guest. That's under the earned media perspective, right? So that you're reaching out to that person. That could be, reaching out to local blogs and doing the same thing and saying, "Hey, listen, I would love to write a blog post about this topic, and the only thing I want back is a link back to my podcast." Right. And so the quid pro quo can be understood and really help elevate the podcast. So let's define maybe the various items, right? Owned media, anything where you control the URL or the response mechanism. So what I mean by that is yourbusinessname.com, right? Your website or business domain. That is owned media because it is your website. You're controlling the URL. Email, right? The response mechanism is the email address. And so therefore people can reply to the email. But that also includes a form, right? A form is something where it's owned media because if someone's coming to the form and they want to access a podcast episode by filling out the form or accessing your podcast by filling out a form, you control that. But if they're going to say podchaser.com and finding your podcast on podchaser.com, that's on shared media because you don't control podchaser.com. They do. Someone else controls it. And so you can think of Facebook or any other social network or platform like that as basically being shared media. But it could be communities. We talked about the Mom Blogger forum earlier, right? That would be a shared medium because you don't control it, somebody else does. Then we go on to earned media. That is going to be any level of guesting. That's going to be any time you are reaching out to industry. Say you want to give a presentation at your upcoming industry conference. So, you're going to basically utilize your podcast as a mechanism for letting your colleagues know about it. So they spread the word to their customers and audiences, which will bring more people into your fold, kind of thing. Not as useful, by the way, if you have a local business that's only selling locally and your conference is like a national conference, because who cares if your colleague from Texas is listening to you and you're from New York State, right? That their audience is going to be also local, right? If they're a bunch of podiatrists, right, in Texas, someone who's going to be telling their clients about listening to your podcast in Texas is not really going to be useful to you. So that's where you'd actually go back to your metrics and you would say, okay, if anyone's listening to us outside of where I'm licensed to practice medicine, I don't care. Who cares about them, right? And you can basically filter them out of your view altogether because they're not useful to you anymore. Maybe you might choose the if you live, say, in the New York metro area, you might choose New Jersey, Pennsylvania, for that region, Connecticut, for regionality because you might get patients from that region. But otherwise, why do you care about someone listening to you from Grenada or from Thailand, right? Who cares? You can just
Let me,
ignore that data.
well, I'm gonna stop you for a second just in case.
Yeah.
What if somebody is listening from Nebraska? They have family in the New York City area and they're enjoying your podcast, and one of their family members needs whatever. You could be top of mind for that local resident. So I just
Yes,
wanted to throw
absolutely.
that out there. I mean, yes, it's not the priority,
No,
but
you're
you never
absolutely
know.
right. You're absolutely right. So there are going to be all kinds of circumstances that break that exception. I'm not telling you that there aren't exceptions. I'm telling you that the vast majority of
Yes.
folks need to focus on their local jurisdiction and their surrounding region. I used to work in estate planning and tax law, and one of the things that we find for a lot of folks is that when mom and dad get older, guess who has to make the decisions about disposition of mom and dad's assets? They may not live locally, right? Son or daughter might live in California while mom and dad live in Virginia. And so you're going to find people searching and looking for things outside of those areas. And from a search engine optimization perspective, that's going to be a problem for that particular industry, right? They can't be so geographically bound to their SEO because someone who may be very far away may be searching. Those are exceptions, right,
Yes.
to the
Yes.
rule.
I've lived
But
that exception, by the way.
yeah. Well, of course, yeah, but many of us have. And so just recognize that does exist, but what I'm talking about is the general rule, but it's good for folks to know that that's a
Mhm.
generality.
Mhm.
And so, and then of course, local media. So you have traditional media, which includes local television, local radio, local magazine, and any other kind of local footprint, which could include local residential newsletters, right, within a neighborhood, e-zines that local folks put together, and then any other kind of curatorial forums or other kinds of reporting. So things like Patch or those kinds of local reporting places, which I kind of bundle into traditional media. But that's local media, and
Mhm.
that can include some local blogs as well. So you have all of those kind of forms of media, and then repurposed media is basically when you're turning one thing into another. Transmogrification, basically, of say a podcast episode where you transcribe it, you get the text of it, and then you rework it into multiple blog posts, right? So if you have a basically any podcast episode over 8 minutes, you in essence have multiple blog posts associated with it, right? Because if you think of a blog post as being roughly about 800 to 2000, 2500 words, if you're talking for 8 minutes, it's moving beyond a single blog post at that point and is covering multiple topics that need to be broken up into. But it could also be YouTube Shorts, Facebook and Instagram Reels, and any other kinds of content that you're doing, creating those many touch points that we talked about otherwise for the business. So repurposing is taking those elements out and breaking them apart so that you can share them in little bits, and then hopefully directing people back to the podcast. So the goal here is for people to understand that you are creating all of these micronized content, or the right term I believe is transmogrify, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong. It's not just transforming, and so by doing that, you're leading people back to the podcast, and you're not leading them back to the business, right? Because the goal here is to actually build the rapport, build the reputation, build the authority, and build that relationship with the individual before they do that, and using the podcast as the mechanism to then lead them further down the funnel. So that's kind of the idea here of utilizing these various promotional systems for sustainability.
Totally agree. I'm with you 100%, Ray.
Yeah.
So I know you wanted to get into one last little bit here before we sign off and give our final remarks. And You consider this promotion as a flywheel, not a megaphone. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I didn't say this earlier, but I've talked about the idea of community as a marketing platform, as a marketing strategy, and that it is more important now than I think it ever has been. If it hasn't already always been important implicitly, now it is important explicitly. So first, if we think about funnels as different ways in which we can move people along, not just the sales line, but also we can move them through a nurture funnel, right? Which is more cyclical, right? Or circular in essence, because people are not all ready to buy from you now. So someone may listen to your podcast for 2 years before they buy from you because they don't maybe they have to save up. Maybe they're buying a car and they want to save up a deposit for their car. So they're saving up, but they're listening to your podcast about your local car dealership. Great. So you need to nurture them. You need to stay top of mind with them until they're ready. And so that might be talking about new cars that are coming into inventory, the market, what are rates looking like for car loans, whatever the things might be that would keep them listening to the podcast and being entertained and educated along the way. So we have this kind of circular effect that we already know about by virtue of understanding how funnels work. And that takes us to the next piece, which is that every episode you publish is like compound interest. You are building a greater and deeper relationship with that individual by virtue of depositing more money into their emotional bank account. And so promotion compounds over time. And that means that every time you do that, there is a little bit of that person that is hopefully going to rub off on another person, right? They're able to go ahead and talk to someone else about it. And that's where consistency beats intensity. Because if you are just a flash in the pan, right, you're going to burn up really quickly and it's not going to stay around. You need to basically get out there and consistently speak to people about topics that are important to the business, important to the brand, important to your reputation. And over time, your audience grows and fits and spurts and kind of spikes, right? So while you need to publish consistently, you need to think about this from the perspective that the growth of your podcast is nonlinear, right? And so it's like a tachycardia or a heart arrhythmia or something like that. It's not, it just comes out of the blue very, very oddly.
Like the stock market, up and
Y-
down.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. But what we know is that the stock market is linear in the sense that over 20 years, it's going to
Yes,
grow.
yes.
It's only in the short terms that it's very, very erratic and
Mhm.
chaotic. And so we need to look at it on the macro perspective. Your podcast will grow over the long term if you watch it, but in the short term, these little tiny bumps and peaks are only visible when you kind of zoom in on the opportunities. So look for those opportunities for shared media and earned media, so you can capitalize on exposure to new audiences. For example, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, are you willing to come do a talk in front of my church group about this topic?" Right, and your podcast is something that can help them. Well, great. That's an opportunity to basically get in front of folks and talk about it. That's going to be earned media, right? And so you're going to go out there and you're going to talk to that community group, and they're going to hopefully some of them will be like, "Oh, you know what? I think I need this product or service, or I want to listen to this podcast." And so they're going to go out there and listen to the podcast and go from there. So think
But you
about it from
also need to let people know you're doing that
Oh,
as well,
absolutely.
so that you get a couple different ways to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's looking for those opportunities when they arise. It may be that someone reshares a post you made on social media and shares it to their audience, right? That the episode spoke to them enough that they wanted to reshare that topic to others, and therefore it's going to open and expose you to the people who follow them, or a fraction of the people who follow them, because that's how kind of social media works. And this is where analytics really comes into play, because analytics is not a way for you to be able to garner more sales. It's a way for you to refine your marketing strategy. So you need to think about this uh, by saying, okay, the data in the aggregate starts to tell us some truths, right? It becomes more axiomatic the larger the data set, until it's too large and then it starts to hallucinate. It's kind of how AI works today, right? When AI has too much information in its context, that's when it starts to hallucinate. It needs the Goldilocks zone of data. And so there's enough data where it reaches this threshold and things become true. And so for you, I challenge you as a podcaster that when you start publishing your podcast, start figuring out the data you need and start putting that together. And then you could throw that actually into Google Sheets workbook. You can throw that into one of whatever chat tool of choice, could be ChatGPT or Google Gemini or Anthropic's Claude or otherwise. And you're going to put enough data into it, and then it's going to start to actually respond with real insights. And at that point, just give it new data that it needs. Don't give it any more. And what you'll do is you'll start to get good information out. Ask good questions. So good data in, good data out. Ask good questions, get good answers. And so this is where you can really utilize some of these tools. And we have the Google Marketing platform. So Google has Google Data Studio, which allows you to visualize data. You have all of these new fantastical tools available to us with AI to be able to slice and dice this data, get this data back. So use analytics as a mechanism for refining your marketing strategy, not to just like throw everything out and start from scratch every time. And that's what I see people doing. They say, oh, you know what? My data told me that I needed to build a whole new website. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, that's the last thing you want to do. I have a website that's, I think, over 20 years old, and it's a terrible URL. And guess what? It's not changing. Why? Because Google has decided that the older a domain name is, the more authority it gets, right? Its age determines its value. We should think about that more in society, but that's me on a soapbox.
Yes.
I come from a culture where we honor our elderly, and so presumably they live that long. They know something. You hope. But the goal for us then is to think about the kind of same thing with regard to each of our forms of analytics, right? Like, what's the right form of data for being able to do these things, right? I've made a decision not to throw out everything just because I could create an exact match domain for my podcast. No, I know that this is good for me. It's like eating your vegetables. I'm going to do the thing I need to do and call it a day, right? And so just keep that in mind. You're building momentum here. You're not chasing virality. And I think a lot of folks really get hooked up in this idea that they want to go viral. And in reality, most virality creates one of two things: a flash, and then you're gone. Nobody cares. Two, is it highlights something about you that you do not want to be highlighted. And so for businesses, that could be the end of the business, right? Because all it does is it brings scrutiny down on you in a way that is never really good, right? It's because some Karen stepped into your restaurant and decided to make a scene, right? And now everybody thinks about you in some negative light. And not all publicity is good publicity, I'm sorry to say, and especially when it comes to social media. And so we need to be very careful about those things. So really don't chase virality. You're looking for small incremental growth over time and looking for opportunities where you might get a little bump here or there by virtue of taking the right opportunities.
You want to be the tortoise, not the hare.
Exactly. But a little bit of hair on occasion.
Okay.
You need to be able to
Okay.
sprint occasionally. Yeah, you just gotta, dodge and weave, dodge and weave.
I'm
So,
definitely the hare or the hare because, well, no, actually, I'm not. I guess I'd be the tortoise because I have no hair. Excuse me.
well, I'll say this: as we've noted throughout this episode, creating a great podcast is, of course, the first step. We need to basically, uh, get it out there and get it out to the world. We then need to get it distributed, right? That means getting it into the various podcast episodes, getting it out there is basically getting the podcast feed alive and getting into the directories, getting it distributed. And that means getting your SEO and your GEO, set up. That's going to be step two. And then finally promoting it, which is basically consistently making the show up for people in the places where they are going to consume it, and taking those opportunities to develop your audience, right? So this is why we use the term development, right? Going from
Mhm.
basically going to that stage of development and promoting your podcast is developing your audience. So don't try to do everything. Choose channels intentionally and integrate your podcast into your broader marketing strategy, right? This is not the only thing. Your podcast is a channel within the strategy, and it's a big part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And we need to make sure it fits into the whole, into the long game. And that means that we're kind of at the end of our time together today, Steve. In our next episode, we'll actually be wrapping up the book. We'll be continuing with our discussion of the book, but this will be chapter 11, in essence, using AI for your podcast. And so we're nearing the end of the series. I can't believe it.
Mm. Yeah. And we don't want people to forget this, though, Ray. You can order our book at podcastingforsmallbusiness.com, and you can access our resources library there too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Always find that information there. You can also contact us if you need us to answer a question. And we really appreciate you listening to this and to us. And hopefully you got value out of it. But either way, this has been Ray Sidney Smith and Steve Orr, the authors of Podcasting for Small Business, the essential blueprint to launch your podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.